some of the stories inside the papers. Sophia Worringer, political commentator with Young Voices UK, is here. Sophia, good morning.
Good morning.
I was mentioning this story inside the Times about sort of the polarisation, particularly of the states, and we know that's, obvious, has been so for so long, but actually maybe that our psyche is quite similar. Only the US is more divided than Britain. Why do you think that might be the case?
I think it's more complicated than just a division along political left and right lines. I think one of the reasons why the country is so divided is the economic disparity that is felt, and particularly this feeling, this perception of people and communities being left behind. For example, in the summer when we had the riots, the places where the riots happened were places where there was a higher than average economic inactivity of people that wanted to work but weren't in work. So it was very closely related to their perception of their opportunity for themselves, for the people in their communities, and the prospects that they thought this country offered them. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have such a divided society. We have this growing gap between the kind of haves and the have-nots. And that's not necessarily just on income. It's also about perception of opportunity and ability to escape poverty.
Yeah, and also it's about sort of how hopeful people are for their futures. I mean, some of this is so dispiriting. Nearly half, so 45% of those questioned said they almost never trusted the government to put the nation's interests first, regardless of the party in power. I mean, that's 45% of us who effectively don't trust politicians, no matter whoever they are.
Yeah, and I think you're right there. This is something going beyond party politics. And in fact, I think the election hasn't really solved the problem. It really doesn't matter who is in power. These trust levels are going down. In fact, the report has shown, and huge events that have really torn the country apart. I know that the survey shows that 8 in 10 British Jews feel less safe than they do before the 7th of October attack. So there's particular tensions being stoked up by international situations that people are responding to in the UK. And I think another very alarming statistic was the fact that 45% of young men surveyed, and this was a mixture of surveys that this report is looking at, had a positive view of Andrew Tate, of course, the kind of social media influencer that has very misogynistic views. So it does show that this is not just on left and right. This is about economic opportunity. This is about gender. This is about ethnicity and kind of cultural heritage as well.
Yeah, it's not just about I think it's about the fabric of our society. It's not just about how we deal with our politicians, but also our neighbours. Only 41% of people trusted their neighbours. You wonder what is behind this this underpin, this lack of trust in really those people closest around us. It's a really fascinating read. Breakfast are going to get more into the detail here. This is Dame Sarah Khan, the government's former counter-extremism czar. Clearly, she's worried that this polarised culture and views can then lead to things like the spread of conspiracy theories and worse. Let's look at the comment section of the Times this morning. We had talked a lot about house building last week as the Prime Minister announced his new milestones. Libby Purvis makes the argument, and I wonder what you make of this, Sophia. NIMBYs are sometimes right.
Yeah, I think she makes a very powerful argument, really, showing that some of the concerns that people raise about house building is not just driven by a selfish desire. It is expressing concern about the type of houses that are built and the design, and in particular how they fit in with local character and how they restrict green spaces. There's a very common shared understanding of what people want for their communities. They want them to be safe, they want them to be sociable, places where they can meet and talk with their neighbours, and they want them to be green. They want to have access to green spaces. So I do think this 1.5 million homes target, as vital as it is got to meet other conditions beyond just the number of units. It's got to think about how it can bring people together, got to tackle social isolation and loneliness. It's got to think about how communities can be brought together by these targets, not driven apart. But having said that, I do think there is a give and take on both sides. We can't just tailor to people who are anti-build. We can neither tailor to people who want to concrete over every spare inch and have units of houses that are very lacking in character and lacking in beauty. So there is a balance there. But I think the government has an opportunity to ensure that this 1.5 million homes target is creating homes that people want to live in and therefore will last for the long term.
Yeah,
There's
will
no good
last. Yeah, and they're not
creating homes.
Yeah, for sure. For the sake of hitting those targets, really, we want something that's they're still going to be standing and strong in 100 years or so.
Absolutely.
There's a really interesting recommendation from the Prison Reform Trust written up in the Times today. It's a charity that was led by Lord Timpson until he was then appointed the Prisons Minister, to kind of give you the context. And what they are suggesting is that inmates should help train prison guards as a radical transformation of the roles, sort of inside prison and then for the people doing the job. What did you make of the proposal?
Well, I think it's very clear that the prison system needs an overhaul. We have such high reoffending rates. Those who are in prison for less than 12 months have a reoffending rate of over 50%. So it's clear something needs to change. And I think they're right that that relationship between the prison officer and the inmate is key. And that stability in that relationship is really important to rehabilitation. But of course, the challenge is whether the inmates themselves will provide the support that is needed for that officer to become a good officer, or whether they will have an ulterior motive. We know that already, and the report kind of highlights this, there are organised crime groups that target recruited police officers, try and bring them in to their network. We know there's very high drug use in prison, and unfortunately some of that is due to staff corruption. So it's a very delicate relationship, because obviously they still need to be able to project authority. That is how the prison system needs to work. So it can't become too chummy.
Yeah, absolutely. Charlie Taylor, the Chief Inspector of Prisons, who's been on this programme and Breakfast several times, he's sort of said what they're seeing is significantly younger recruits than they did 10 years ago. Some hired straight from school. And, historically prison officers would have been hired from the services or armed forces. And, you're talking about sort of imbuing that authority. If it's your first job, and sometimes, we did some extraordinary reporting at the Times here undercover about the kind of checks and balances that went in place before you became a prison officer. In some cases it was just a matter of weeks training. That's not going to imbue authority if you're sort of, 21 and it's your first job and you're completely, as I can imagine, feeling pretty terrified. There is a very annoying story I found in the Times this morning. If the voice on the line as you try to book a Florida sunshine break sounds a little robotic, there could be a simple explanation. One of Britain's biggest hotel booking websites is using AI travel agents, Sophia. Says most customers don't realise they're not speaking to a human. Have you had this experience where you ring someone and they're pretending to be a person and you say, please can I speak to a real person? You realise you've been on the phone to AI?
I've not had that experience. I think I would find it a bit disconcerting. I do think, it's impressive that system is in operation, but I do think they should flag from the outset that this is not a human. However sophisticated the response may be, I think people would find it slightly jarring to then learn, 10 minutes into the conversation, they've been building a relationship with a robot to try and get them a good deal. There's no point sweet talking a robot. It's probably pre-programmed to not give you the deal, or to give you the deal depending on what someone's decided before. It can't necessarily make a decision. It's an incredibly impressive feat, but I do think what is sad if people then lose their jobs based on this. It needs to upskill the current call centre workforce so that they can move on to new and more exciting roles, rather than just kind of bin them off and replace them with robots completely.
But so often when you ring customer service, they'll say there's answers on our website, and you think, if I could have found the answer, I would not be sitting in this phone call here. This is Hotel Planner, so it recorded phone calls to create 20 AI agents who are programmed to engage in realistic two-way conversations in 15 languages. So when the Times rang, they spoke to Cassandra, the AI travel agent, and there was sort of call centre and typing noises going on in the background. It feels fundamentally dishonest to me, Sophia, to not declare initially you're speaking to a machine.
Absolutely, and particularly if they're leaning into it with this background noise and trying to make it sound like you're calling from the hubbub of a real call centre. And of course, these AI chatbots can operate 24 hours a day, whereas previously the human employees worked from 6 till midnight. Still very long shift. I don't know who's booking holidays at 3 a.m, but I guess there are some people. So I do think, yeah, they're leaning into the fact they want people to believe it's real. So there'll be lots of people who've had their whole interaction, not had a particularly complicated question and thought they've spoken to the lovely Cassandra, and unfortunately haven't at all.
Final thing I wanted to ask you about, the Bishop of London's been writing in the Radio Times. The Times have written it up this morning. She says streaming services have made watching television a more solitary and insular experience because people now rarely enjoy the same shows at the same time. The headline is, "Thou shalt not indulge in solo binge watching." Have you indulged, Sophia?
I'm sure I have. I don't think it's impossible to not really in the streaming services that are now. I think the bishop makes a good point, but also she points to places times like Christmas where people do watch the same thing at the same time, and that brings like a particular joy. And there have always been programs that really grip the nation all at once. I remember Line of Duty, for example, the final. That was something everyone had really cottoned on to, and then you have that buzz of, did you watch it? What did you think the next day? So yeah, in some ways it's a shame that people have lost that as a regular experience. But I don't know what the solution is. Streaming services are here to stay. I think people will have that flexible watching option into the future. So I guess it's more about treasuring the times where it does happen, and places like Christmas where people are brought together by television.
Sophia, thank you so much. Sophia Worringer, political commentator with Young Voices UK, going through the papers with me this morning. Sophia, thank you.
Thanks so much, Rosie.